Okay, June 6th, 2022. We can't help noticing how at many places, at many levels, people are thirsting for power, people thirsting for riches, are making themselves felt, and sometimes in unimaginable ways. So how are we going to begin to redirect civilization unless we have a much better understanding of ourselves? And as you know, I don't think that's possible without us considering that we're trying to hold three unintegrated, archaic consciousnesses that have been with us since the beginning of our time. That's the Anunnaki consciousness, the Homo erectus consciousness, and the consciousness of the very first, very confused humans. Another way of looking at it, we have two threads of inheritance, the Anunnaki thread and the Homo erectus thread, that are, they're woven together in a very complicated way. Genetics, epigenetics, culture, psychology, spirit. Hi, Nurit. Well, glad to see you. Nurit is one of Rabbi Reef Brenner's daughters. So, and even the Anunnaki thread is itself a bit complex, because they too evolved out of more primitive hominins. As a matter of fact, sometimes they sit back and wonder why, according to the tablets, is Enlil from the start so put off by humanity, which has a component of a primitive Homo erectus, in us. Why is he so disgusted with that? Maybe it's an inability to embrace their own primitive origins. Maybe in some way he's fighting that inheritance from millions and millions of years, of their years before. So I'd like to spend the first part of our time this evening on finding out just how much we can deduce about the Anunnaki from the records, from our other sources of information. What can we figure out about that component of us? First of all, where did they evolve? Well, clearly on their home planet, but where was that? That could not have been out in the dark of space. Without a sun nearby, advanced life can't develop. So that's out of the picture. So they were close enough to a sun to have the energy for higher life to develop. One possibility is some other sun, and they got ejected from that system and got captured by our sun. A much more parsimonious explanation is that they were closer to our sun and got ejected. We've been finding that there are lots of planets in that situation that are exoplanets, other solar systems that are made up not only of planets like ours, that are rotating in a more or less circular orbit around their suns. But there are a good number that are circling like comets, spending most of their time far, far from their home star. And in recent years, astronomers have worked out the math to show how that can happen, and in a rearrangement of the planets of the system, a planet can be thrown out of the system or almost thrown out of the system. So the records are mum about most of Anunnaki history, most of the history of Nibiru, except for some tidbits that we're using. So we don't know about that, but it's almost a certainty that they were in our system. And then where? Well, this is a little bit of chain of logic here that I can't totally catch at this moment, but very likely the orbit that we are in right now, Earth's orbit. So in a rule, which is not quite given the honor of being a physical law, what's called Bode's rule, there's a harmony in the orbits around the sun. As a matter of fact, in the orbits around all of the suns that have been explored, and around the planetary systems of moons around Jupiter and Saturn, there's a certain harmony of distances. And this orbit that we are in, there has been from early on a third rock from the sun. And putting all of our stories together, it does appear that originally the third rock from the sun was the home planet of the Anunnaki. So when they came to Earth, it wasn't simply finding a mining colony on another world. It was also had an aspect of returning home to a place in the solar system that they'd been ejected from and forced to be away from for a great deal of time, but probably millions of years. So there was a lot of tension that's not written into the record about going to Earth. Now, we deduce that before the rearrangement of the solar system bodies that ejected what got to be called Nibiru, the planet of the crossing, they had to be pretty advanced to be able to predict what was going to happen and to prepare to survive the catastrophe of ejection and to survive a totally new environment in deep space. So it had to be pretty advanced. We don't have any reason to believe, though, that having an advanced civilization and having cities requires the kind of mess that we're in. There's no reason to think that early on they were a happy civilization, living gloriously. We have hints that sizable settlements can live in harmony with themselves and with nature in these great circular cities that have recently been excavated in Ukraine and areas nearby. Tens of thousands of people without any hierarchy, without any palaces, without any signs of centralized government. Matter of fact, many signs of decentralized government in the ring structure of these cities. So there's no reason to think that they didn't have a fine life and a high civilization that was the kind that at this point we can only pray for ourselves. It's possible that the myth of a gleaming city, high culture, an ideal place to live that got swallowed up by the ocean, crumbled and swept away, of Atlantis, the myth of Atlantis, is a memory of what happened to their cities when they were thrown out of this third orbit and thrown far from the sun. I speculate about that because, as Linda reminded me a few weeks ago, that the myth of Atlantis has a lot of drawing power. It's very, very convincing for many people, and yet where's the evidence? It's not a speck of evidence physically. And regarding physical evidence, that's related to the possibility of a city being swept away by the ocean. There's the aquatic ape hypothesis that holds that in our inheritance, in our line, there was a period of time when we lived in a marine environment, spent a lot of time in water, developed many adaptations to water, and then returned to a much drier life on land. And there devoted a section of Evolution Diverted to the aquatic ape hypothesis because it's so attractive. There are so many things in our physiology and in our behavior that suggest that we have water in our past. However, where's the physical evidence? Other species that went from land to water and back to land left a very, very clear record in the fossils, and that's the elephants and the hippos. And if we did the same, why aren't there fossil remains of intermediate forms for us? My suggestion is that those fossils are on the bureau, and the inheritance of marine adaptations came into us with the genetic engineering that the Anunnaki did. For some reason, or reasons, they wanted to wanted to give us those characteristics. You can speculate why that was, but so we're beginning, to get some of the components of, what's in the Anunnaki psyche. Another piece is, well, if their planet was suddenly going to be thrown out, how could they have survived what was going to happen in the atmosphere, the oceans, on the surface? It was going to be an unbelievable catastrophe, and most likely they could survive only by going underground into caverns that they prepared. And again, we have to think about myth. Um, the Greek idea of the underworld, the whole world down there. That's been a persisting idea through literature ever since. Um, Showing up, I guess, most recently in the Matrix movies with the city of Zion underground. And, you know, maybe I don't know what can inspire serious spelunkers, to spend as much time and put themselves in such danger as they do. Um, is it a species, a racial thing, showing up in them, drawing them underground? Because they talk about it in ecstatic terms about what it's like being down there. I don't get it, but I can see something could be sparked in some people. So they wound up coming back to the surface because it's clear from the tablets that they had cities and palaces and all that was made habitable by a heat reflective golden sphere surrounding the whole city. The whole planet. And again, they don't quite say that in the records, but they do say that gold was critical for their life, that there was a problem with the gold in the atmosphere. They had to have more. Just those are the pieces I put together to say that reflective shell of minute particles was what made life on the surface possible. Couldn't have been a very natural life. They'd never see the stars. They'd have, unless they created night and dark, it was a very uniform place. Plants would be, grown under artificial light. What I'm saying is that over ages and ages, millions of years actually, if we put the chronology together, millions of years, in this elongated orbit, visiting the sun every 3,600 years, there was a life in a highly artificial world, and they got divorced from nature, and therefore from a great deal of nature within themselves, had to be. And on top of their initial traumatization, they were repeatedly re-traumatized. As far as I could tell, it had to be, because every time they came close to the sun, approached the sun, and then when they left, so twice on each 3,600 year cycle, they passed through the asteroid belt. After they had the one passage that was terrifying, and then they get terrified every time after that. And the one I'm talking about is the very clearly documented and described collision of one of Nibiru's moons with the planet that was between Mars and Jupiter. In other words, in orbit number 4, the fourth rock from the sun. And horrendous collision, the debris eventually spreading out and forming the asteroid belt, which then the Bureau had to pass through twice on each passage. So imagine, you know, what it would be like on Earth, you know, if we were passing through a belt of asteroids. Right now, we're thinking of what we're going to do to prevent the collision of just one that might come close sometime in the future. And we're talking about lasers and all kinds of intercepts. But imagine if we were passing through thousands of them, which apparently they had to do. So maybe they went back underground on each passage through the solar system. Anyway, it had to be terrifying. So here they are, cut off from nature to a great extent, terrified repeatedly. The picture becomes clear of a traumatized species, and that seems to fit with the behavior of the nobility, the behavior and the social structure, highly rigidified ranks, with deference and obedience built in, with I don't know if it's an underclass, but with commoners who were commanded by the elite. Dynastic struggles. A very troubled place and troubled race. So when we think about, say, a nuclear family, you know, with a very troubled parent and the impact on the children, large scale, that's us. Now, what does that mean? I'll take a pause here. I'm going to breathe for a while, and any thoughts that you want to bring in at this point, I'll be quiet for a minute. There's nothing to suggest that they loved this planet that they came to. Dominate, yes. Exploit, yes.
Mike,
Yes.
can you hear me okay? Good.
Yeah.
The piece I've been thinking about the most recently is around I'd really like to know a lot more about the manifestations of trauma. And the reason that I keep coming back to this is this idea that we as a species possess abilities that we can't access. And boy, that's an idea that you can support that pretty solidly. So I assume that it's trauma that's suppressing our abilities or something like that. And I'd really like to know a little bit more about what psychiatry has to say about, what the details of how does trauma work differently in different people, and what kinds of I just don't know a whole lot about it. and since you're bringing it up, I'd like to know more from that perspective. Is that a reasonable question?
Sure. Well, okay. Now, there's more than one system in the nervous system. There's more than one subsystem that's devoted to protecting life and enhancing life. One is the affect system, which generates the emotions. Okay? There's the attachment system, which has to do with bonding and loyalty. And then there are the threat responses, which are visceral responses to threat to safety or life, or at least a perceived threat. Okay? And that's housed in the autonomic, the visceral nervous system, which has, you might say, two modes of operating. If you think about a needle, a gauge, okay, it goes between activation for protection. We're in threat, we're in danger, and then, oh, things are nice, things are good. We can take it easy now. So this limb involves reactions of fight and flight and freeze. The other side allows for ingestion and reproduction, and we go back and ordinarily life, this aspect of the governance of the viscera, is a back and forth balance, okay, around a midline. And all of the functions that are controlled, to some extent controlled, by the autonomic system show this variance. As an example, your blood pressure might measure on average 120. But actually, if you measure it moment to moment, it will be varying between 116, 116 and 124. They'll be going back and forth under the influence of those two sides of the autonomic system. Okay. When you are in traumatizing circumstances, you're over here. Okay. And if conditions are right, you can restore, you can be resourced, and you can return to the status quo ante. Okay. However, if you're interrupted, and are not able to recover, then you wind up no longer really on this midline. Your midline is over here somewhere, and you are way more prone to go in this direction. So you're more reactive. So this reactivity, shows up as an exaggerated startle response, vigilance, rigid. This is just a long list of dysfunctions that are, when they're severe, it's post-traumatic stress disorder.
So, for example, when I had a little go-in with the credit card company, the bank and the credit card people last week, and I got angry. I didn't really lose my temper, but I got angry. And I realized after I got off the phone that because I was angry, I didn't think very well. Right?
Absolutely, it does.
So that's what you're talking. Yeah,
it does take the frontal cortex offline to some extent, and interferes with the communication between the left and right hemispheres also.
Ah,
So the emotion on the right side will take over. And your ability to think through what's going on is not so great. And so there was threat, however you want to put it, there was threat to you from what they were telling you or not telling you or not doing. Okay.
right.
Okay. But just for a little academic clarification, the threat system was not the only one involved. The emotional system was also involved. Okay, so you can be in fight, which is from the brainstem, and that's in the trauma circuit. But you can also be in anger, which is in the emotional system and the limbic part of the brain. Okay, so we're and we can also have thought processes that are involved. So the three levels of the triune brain are engaged in pretty much everything we do. But when the traumatization is severe enough, then that becomes the dominant pattern. So you're overreactive, but you're also dull. You're also numb. And that's true of the culture as a whole.
So did the Anunnaki have reason to want us to be traumatized, do you think? Did they understand that traumatizing us would limit our capacities? Because it sure does.
I think look, I think that the traumatization that they caused in us through never-ending warfare was probably not their goal. I think they found a more what shall I say? I think they relied more on shame and humiliation rather than to keep us in line, rather than the disability of trauma.
I just something keeps, and this is just an intuitive hit, but I think, but I just something keeps suggesting to me that they realized at some point that their creation had capacities that they lacked, and that there was a sense of keeping us in line, and there was a little jealousy involved.
And maybe hatred.
Well, and hatred, particularly of people that, like, I don't know, there's racial hatred that seems to come from them. And I think hidden in there is the understanding that the beings you're hating are actually better than you.
We have a really good update of that scenario in the European colonists coming to North America.
Yeah.
They were a long way from being natural people, so they cut down the forests, the fearsome, fearful forests. They cut them down and tried to establish a far less natural system of growing foodstuffs. The natives had a terrific system that had been worked well for thousands of years.
Well, we keep learning more about that system all the time. Haven't they just discovered, was it oysters that the native peoples in the Northeast managed, or maybe it's the Northwest, managed for millennia, and then we came along and destroyed the sources of the
Yes, there are some places
stuff like
where
that.
there are huge mounds of oyster shells.
Mhm.
But also, not only look at how the Puritans and others, treated the natives. You
Yeah.
know, and but there was a recognition that they did have something that the European white guys didn't have, and that's why fair number of people, quote, went native,
Mm,
finding that was a far
right,
superior way of life.
right.
And some American writers, like Thomas Paine, were very specific about that. They've got us beat. They have a far superior way of life. Um,
Hmm.
so jealousy, hatred. I mean, um, the hate, the one who is cut off from nature, cut off to some extent from love, hates the
Yeah.
ones who aren't.
Right. Right.
By the way, I think that's a component of misogyny.
I just wrote about that in my journal this morning, that part of the core of misogyny is the unconscious, perhaps, recognition that we can do things you can't.
That's right. And are in, it's much less likely for a woman to be cut off from nature than it is for men. Men can do it
Right.
more easily, put it that way.
Mm, right.
Um, so that hostility, then that to some extent that gets built into us, because that's one part of us being disgusted with and fearful about the other part, and the dominated part being cowed and terrified, but also rebellious. Um, so these two streams of consciousness could easily get us off balance, and then they get separated out and separated into different philosophies, different political leanings. Um, so part of their traumatization is a tendency to violence. Um, the deference and obedience built into their culture. I think that's an adaptation to kind of make things work. Other things that come through in the tablets, they're perfectionistic. Certainly, they had highly advanced aesthetics. The tomb artifacts from Ur are they rival all the magnificent, beautiful things from Egypt, and they're at least 1,000 years older than the oldest Egyptian findings. and their craftsmanship was known even in ancient times. The cloth, for example, was famous throughout the whole Middle Eastern world. You know, and where did the Mesopotamians get the skill to do that? But teachings of their lords. Much of the teaching, by the way, didn't come from the highest of the gods, but from lesser gods, you know, nieces and nephews and grandchildren who were given different responsibilities in the culture and in relation to the humans. So the struggle within us, on one side is the Anunnaki preference for rules and laws, okay? But that's not, you know, that's not the way it works in the indigenous world. There are customs, but people are free to do what they want pretty much. Following instinct, following patterns that are somewhat genetically determined, but not codes of laws. Dominance, subjugation, you know, versus the indigenous way of life, which is cooperation. Equality of individuals, equality of rights. I think you know, that there's a spontaneous healing power in understanding all of this. In other words, if this is really how we came apart, came together, how we became who we are. And I'm convinced that maybe a few details are off, but this is essentially what must have happened. You know, then knowing that in itself has huge healing potential.
Well, Mike, I'd say here is that I think accepting the possibility of an alternative to a disaster is healing, and that's the start of it. Or that's a start. And that little start mixed with other little starts, some may coalesce into something that's more genuine and long lasting. But I think the requirement really is for people to want to change something. If you're okay with how it is, if you and your family or you yourself, you and your friends are doing okay or even great, what's to change? No pilgrim left England because he fit in perfectly with society in England at that time. They wanted change, and speaking of the New England colonists, is they just sought to impose what they were familiar with, the English farming countryside. They didn't really think there was anything any better.
Well, the ambivalence around change is powerful.
Yeah.
We're for it and against it. But what you, I think, first referred to was hope.
You know, hope that something might be better.
Yeah, that it is justified to hope that something could be different, something could be better.
Yes.
And here on Earth.
Yes.
And that is that's been lacking. You know, we've been running out of capacity to hope for something different.
Well, there's a lot of people that are good with the way it is.
Yes. Um, um, the road to something different might not be all that peaceful. That's a huge country. You know, we just don't know, but what we do know is that it's rational and necessary to instill new surges of hope in our kind. And to do that, we need a major reset. We need a new paradigm, because clearly, you know, all of our best efforts are not succeeding. We're trying really hard and we're not getting anywhere. Getting some funny light here. Let me just change my lighting a little bit. Yeah. So I mean, that's, you know, knocking wood, you know, I mean, that's the major aim of this movie project that I'm moving along, which is to give a glimpse of, you know, a way forward to a better direction, you know, how it could happen. And not to give away too much of the story, you know, it happens through a dissemination of this story of the origin of humanity, of our, you know, our complex mixture, the intrusion into our natural evolution, this admixture of a, you know, of a happy creature living in nature with a traumatized being, largely divorced from nature. There's a huge aha, you know, you say, yes, this makes sense. Finally, it makes sense, because, you know, if you look at us, don't, you know, if you within the established framework, scientific, philosophical, spiritual, you know, we don't make sense. It doesn't make sense, and that's, you know, that cognitive dissonance is one of our, you know, is a major stressor. We did not make sense. I know of a kid who was given a you know, a nutshell version of the story, and she said, "Oh, well, that's why we don't fit in." You know, I think kids will get it. I think kids will get it. So the sequel to the movie is probably going to have to be a cartoon for kids. Now, I don't know how much energy we got to get into uh, the way in which all of this shows up in Civil War. But some people are wondering whether we are now in the early stages of a cold civil war in this country. And if so, it would be actually the fourth. It's very much in the consciousness of governance in this part of North America. I say the fourth because the big civil war in the 1860s was actually the third. The American Revolution was really a civil war, because as far as the forces lining up were concerned, about a third of the population supported the Patriots, about a third were loyalists, and maybe another third were not particularly one way or the other. But it wasn't just us against the Brits. There was this huge division in population on these shores. And that had something similar had happened about 100 years before. And it was over matters of governance and whether the royal governors or the constituent assemblies would have power. And there was some fighting. And there was open conflict, again, about 100 years earlier. Now, I've been wondering if the earliest wars in Mesopotamia can be understood as wars of nation states against each other, like we have in human history, or if those were more like civil wars, because it was the same culture, they all spoke the same language. It wasn't one religion against another. It was one originally not deified. They were deified only after they created the human armies. But originally it was just one ruler, and often against his cousin or other relative. So the earliest wars in Mesopotamia had a lot of similarity to civil wars. The parallels between the war between the states, the Civil War, and now, they're significant. People who are people now are causing trouble, you might say. People who feel exploited, unempowered, deprecated, victimized. That's exactly the way the Southern elite saw themselves. They saw themselves as the victims of the North. A particular kind of patriotic zeal, attachment to the flag and the symbol, that was going on then in a very powerful way. And a certain amount of geographic definition of the opposing forces. Wasn't just, simply north and south. It was much more complicated than that. There was a lot of, quote, Southern sympathy in the north. There were Southerners in the Appalachians who fought for the Union. There were a lot of people in the South that did not favor secession, but they knew to keep their mouths shut. So it was, a largely a geographic division, but not a neat and clean one. Same thing now. It's largely geographic division, but not all that neat and clean. Linda said she had to go, and she's actually gone. Now, if you'd like, take a vote. Maybe we can plunge into the specifics of the American Civil War of the 1860s and how that was a manifestation of our inheritance from Mesopotamia. We could get into that if you wish, or we can leave that for another time, maybe in the fall. Do we have a consensus?
I say go for it.
Go for okay. Jim, you're muted, but you're smiling, so I guess that's a positive. All right. Let me once again adjust the light. No, that's too much of a good thing. Okay, that's better. I'm going to refer a lot to the Civil War in America chapter. So, 3 factors dramatically increased the needs for slaves in the South. Vast stretches of land were opened up for planting to the west. Technical advances magnified the demand for raw cotton, advances largely in England. And by 1803, the importation of slaves was outlawed. So by mid-century, the prices for slaves were about 200 times what they'd been earlier. So a tragic restaging of humanity's origin resulted. Let's see, excuse me, my room is getting a little bit too dark on the screen, so let me improve things again. Hopefully that's better. Okay. Plantations of Virginia, Carolinas, and Georgia, not so well suited for large-scale crops as the newer ones in Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. They couldn't compete with them. So instead, the older plantations began producing the growing workforce needed in the newly opened lands, and they turned to breeding slaves as their main source of income. That enterprise replayed how humankind came into existence, right? To serve the overlords. The birth rate among slaves in the older plantations increased to nearly 4 times the previous norm. By 1860, the Old South had sent 1 million souls westward, adding an increased rending of family ties to everything that the enslaved population was already experiencing. That migration was horrible. We'll get to the details. And a second reenactment was also in progress. Masters were engaging in sex with their slaves. This became well known. By 1830, the term fancy girl was shamelessly included in commercial notices of slave trades. White men interbreeding with their female property reenacted what had once gone on between the Anunnaki commoners and the human bachelor commoners and the human women, which resulted in the new mixed race, the elite humans. So that was a second piece of reenactment going on. Now, all organized warfare is horrific because it reignites the love of war we fell into through our service in the wars of the gods. It's a trauma bonding phenomena that we actually got in love with militarism, in love with war itself. Civil war is the most vicious of wars because it reenacts the rivalry between the clans of the gods. The American Civil War was the most destructive of all civil wars. Still true. Because with it, emotions were unmasked, whose source was the slavery into which humankind was born. In the United States, there was more personal freedom than the civilized world had ever known. A conflict-laden revival of humanity's original bondage, though, took place. Liberty could not tolerate being so compromised. Slavery could not be sustained in a free nation. The cause of war was slavery. That's clear. Grant knew that war was coming as soon as he heard that Lincoln was elected because of how strongly Lincoln had spoken against slavery years before. In the South, the war is called the War Between the States. That's interesting because it's really a conflict between two states of mind. With a mindset of freedom for all, the Unionists confronted their inner slave identity by aiming to do away with the institution itself. With a mindset of liberty for the elite, the Confederates developed a more complex engagement with their inner slave identity. They meant to bury it even deeper by reconfirming their master identity. The social ideal for the North was democratic. For the South, it was aristocratic. The conflict was driven by starkly opposing ways of dealing with humanity's original condition and also ways of conceptualizing the nation. Except in the Appalachians, the people of the South had never been passionate in the cause of personal freedom and broad democracy. The two main cultures of the South were allied, the Tidelands and the Deep South. They were allied in the principle that true liberty was granted to very few. Their tradition was one in which an elite stratum governed a mass of obedient citizenry. It came to them through the royalists and cavaliers in England, having flowed from the Norman strain of British culture. The spiritual ancestors of these people were of two kinds: the noble elite who served the living gods of Mesopotamia, and the obedient, enthralled masses.
Mike,
Yeah.
would you consider a slightly alternative kind of way of thinking about the Civil War? Really, the economics of it have to be considered as well. They weren't fighting for releasing African Americans. They didn't really care about the African Americans. It was really a conflict between two economic systems, one that was capitalist, that's the North, and one that was feudal, that was the South. And I understand your thesis about slavery and it being somehow imprinted in us. But on the other hand, there really was no desire to free slaves. They wanted a labor pool and they wanted new consumers. And that's what they were fighting for, the North. And they got it. I mean, and they continued, of course. And of course, slavery has never ended. I mean, incarceration rates are incredibly high among African Americans, and then they can't get jobs again. You know, it's like on and on. It's just a different form of slavery. So I'm wondering how much the economics of it was something you considered when you developed this theory, this thesis.
A good deal. The thing about the economics, Marie, is that they all revolved around cotton.
Absolutely, absolutely.
All revolved around cotton. And,
well, cotton in the South
cotton would not be an issue without slavery.
Right, until of course the new technologies came in, and then they weren't necessary. You didn't need the same amount of human.
They couldn't. The economics were, yes, there was a good deal of manipulation on the part of Northerners, and the Southern merchants certainly had some reason for grievance, but at the heart of it. It was all about cotton, and cotton was all about slavery.
Well, right, because the South needed pickers they didn't have to pay, otherwise their whole economic system would fall. Exactly right. The North did not need the cotton pickers. That was not their source of economic revenue.
The North is a mixed picture, and when you talk about the Yankees, okay, in Maine and Massachusetts, they literally hated slavery and they wanted it to be abolished.
There was a segment like that, absolutely. But the reason why the war started, it would not have become a movement had the capitalists not supported it, because they saw an opportunity to demolish an economic system that was not theirs. They didn't care about, and they wanted to change.
Excuse me, this has been thrown about for quite a while.
Okay.
That it was economic. It was, but I'm pretty sure that historians recently have been coming around to the centrality of slavery in the Civil War. Okay.
Yeah.
For political reasons, Lincoln could not push for emancipation early on. It would have, was an impossibility for lots of reasons.
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. It's very interesting what you're talking about. I'm really listening intently.
Well, Mike, if I may jump in, is on the economic picture, has anyone speculated historically if a couple of more decades had proceeded without the Civil War, changing everything, and technological ag tools became more available, the drill, planting, and so on, so that and the cotton picker harvesting to go along with the ginning mills, happened to cotton in the South, how much would there be a demand for slaves? They would be a burden, other than having a few that were good at making mechanical repairs, which is what happened on the plains, and which was an extension of the failure of agriculture in New England once grain growing technology tools became available. Barry, in the north for growing wheat and so on, oats, all the small grains, well, corn also, but all the small grains primarily is once those tools became available, west of the New England just expanded, and it couldn't have expanded very much in ag production without those tools, and basically buried deep six New England ag economies, as well as most of Western Europe.
Well, there have been some novels written about what would have happened if the South won the war. I don't think anybody has written one, what would have happened if there hadn't been a war. If the hotheads in Charleston hadn't fired on the flag.
Right.
No, I don't think anybody's tried to figure that one out.
I don't quite remember the development of the technology for cotton, but it wasn't. I think it was only a few decades later that the mechanical stuff was available, or becoming available. And man, you wouldn't, once those machines got going, I mean, even pulled by horses only, never mind tractors, you didn't need a bunch of slaves around.
Again, who knows what would have happened, but yeah, particularly since so much capital was tied up in them.
Yes. Yes. I remember one time I tried to do a back of the envelope calculation on, couldn't the North have just bought out the slave wealth in the South? And the answer was absolutely not. It was just too overwhelmingly expensive.
Right. Now, a little bit more about the cultural conflict. The cultures in the North were allied in assigning the highest value to freedom, holding it to be the universal right of mankind. The view had been passed on to them by the British farmers, traders, and parliamentarians, by Dutch merchants also, and its source was in the self-reliant Anglo-Saxon and Norse strains of British culture, and in the libertarian leanings of the Dutch. Their forebears were familiar with freedom and self-rule, a spiritual gift from the humans who left the settlements of the Anunnaki lords and ventured out on their own. First in this regard were the New Englanders. The Yankees, who had triggered the American Revolution, became the most ardent defenders of the Union. Slavery violated their ethic of self-sufficiency. Its cruelty disgusted them, and they determined to end it once and for all. In them, the suffering inherent in humanity's birth into slavery was rising fast toward consciousness. It called many of them to abolitionism. As humanity's original plight, being a slave and having a slave consciousness buried inside, as humanity's original plight bubbled toward consciousness in the nation, the South's response was the opposite of the North's. The typical Southerner aimed to defend himself against his buried slave identity by solidifying his role as lord and master, or at least the master's ally. The oligarchs of the Deep South thought of their society as a towering human achievement. They claimed that it was modeled after the republics of Rome and Athens, where the elites could follow higher pursuits only because of the labor provided by their slaves. some of them wrote about the brilliance of their culture is just beyond belief. Some of them thought that enslaving the poor whites would be a great advantage to that population, that they would benefit from losing, from giving up what shreds of freedom they had. They'd be much better off serving the nobility of the South. The Southerners' secret hatred of slavery helps explain something that's little known. They themselves brought about its end. Given the compromise built into the Constitution, slavery could never be outlawed through due process, no matter how the abolitionists fumed and threatened. The matter was clear to Lincoln. He believed that the South would never resort to war over slavery. I'll jump ahead. You see, the Southern oligarchs saw themselves as the new demigods. From the Mesopotamian tale, we learn. Hold on a second. Back a paragraph. In the History of the American People, Paul Johnson states, there are many irrational and inexplicable aspects to the whole controversy over slavery, which baffle historians as they baffle people in the middle at the time. The abolitionist Frederick Douglass wrote that powers beyond human understanding were at work. We have fallen into the mighty current of eternal principles, invisible forces, which are shaping and fashioning events as they wish, using us only as instruments to work out their results, their own results. From the Mesopotamian tale, we learn what those forces were. Our early traumatizing and humiliating servitude, surging into awareness, producing two opposite responses to long-buried memories. Both sides took up arms in the cause of freedom as they saw it. One thought as if none were free unless all were free. The other fought as if for some to have freedom, others had to be deprived of it. Their fervent cries combined into the perfect formula for disaster, perfect storm. On the one hand, we will finally feel free, internally, personally, feel free, because soon there'll be no more slavery in this land. The other side, we will finally feel free because we will be confirmed as the masters of this land. Lincoln knew that freedom was really the issue here, not slavery, not North versus South. Could people be free and self-governing, or would civilized humanity forever be ruled by those who had gained power through inheritance or manipulation? Civilization had always tended toward rule by elites who had status and wealth. Slavery in America was the cutting edge of the blade that separated humanity from freedom, subjugation to power. Lincoln had spoken of the worldwide importance of the principles in the Declaration of Independence when, heading to his first inauguration, he personally raised the flag at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, saying, There was something in the Declaration giving liberty not alone to the people of this country, but hope to the world for all future time. In his address at Gettysburg, he said that the war was testing the principles of governance through self-rule. The United States was a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. And the war was testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. Could self-rule succeed as the basis for a nation state? When it had been tried in the past, as in Athens and Rome, it had required slave labor. In the late 18th century, the Dutch experiment, no king, had begun to totter. And in the first half of the 19th century, the revolutions for liberty in Europe had all failed. The revived monarchies in the continent were hoping for the collapse of the American experiment at the very moment that Lincoln was speaking. He saw that government of the people, by the people, for the people, was at risk and could indeed perish from the earth. So let us hope that we are careful and aware and awake as we move forward now. We've been lucky. In this country, we've had great leaders step forward when they were needed. Washington, Lincoln, Grant, to FDR. I suppose the most important thing in in orienting our efforts, each of us, to do what we can do, is to make sure we're maintaining hope. Not just for survival, but for healing. Many, many ways in which we're pursuing it. New Reach organization has been doing that in Israel.
Thank you for the shout out. It's actually in both countries, in the US and in Israel.
Yes, you're colonizing the United States.
Oh, no, I wouldn't. We're decolonizing. We're decolonizing and re-indigenizing is the way we put it. And there are a lot of layers to the decolonize. I keep finding more layers in myself that need to be decolonized. There's just so many layers, so many ways our minds have been colonized. Our whole way of life is colonized. So, we have to keep kind of peeling it back. And then at the same time, the flip side of that is the re-indigenizing, which is what you're talking about, is that divorce from nature that you're talking about. It's reconnecting to nature, finding ongoing ways to talk to the trees, to feel the land, to plant, to grow, to be in touch with the rhythms of the earth. I mean, there's so many ways of re-indigenizing. Even just noticing the phases of the moon is part of that. And then there are the levels where we want to also notice how the earth or the universe is talking to us, including, through synchronicities, through signs, through meaningful coincidences that happen. I mean, there's all kinds of ways that to me is re-indigenizing.
Something which gives some reason to be enthusiastic about that concept is that if I read the sequence right, that happened because the humans who got away from the domains of the Anunnaki, who by whatever means drifted away or released, or they got away with different levels of indoctrination, different levels of skill, but still they got away and reconnected with the Homo erectus part of themselves. They heard that voice.
Yeah.
And because they didn't grow up in nature, they grew up in the cities of the Lords, but they got away.
Yeah.
And they relearned what was still in them.
Yeah.
They reactivated it. So I think that's happened before.
And it's returning.
And there are, as I'm sure you know, there are elements within the Native American communities which are trying to save the white man.
Yeah.
Which are despite what was done to them, they are reaching out and trying to teach the medicine wheel, teach plant spirit medicine.
Yep.
They're actively trying to do that. Not all, some are just way too bitter and too broken, but
but that's the kind of thing I do, and the people we call circles. We convene circles of whatever, just to talk about. The medicine wheel is a very powerful technology for re-indigenizing, for understanding. And a dear friend of mine, who I'm quoting him when he talks about this, he says that the white people, this is a little, I'm not quite sure how, I'm sure it fits into your thesis, although I'm not sure how. I'd have to understand it better. But that our white Western, let's call it Western industrial society, sees the world as very flat, whereas for the indigenous folks and those that remained over the centuries connected to the land, there's a lot more depth. So we have to find that depth again, how we talk to our ancestors, how we talk to the earth, how we communicate. There's so much more that we in the West, in the industrial society, have sort of collapsed it into kind of a flatness, just to use that as a kind of image of like this flat cycle as opposed to a kind of sphere. So I have a feeling this all connects to what you teach all the time anyway.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Reeve, are you still there? We haven't.
I know he went down for a bite to eat. I just.
Oh, okay.
So,
So we're gonna fold it up for tonight, I think. And I think it's a good idea to take a break for the summer and come back in September. So you'll hear from me in August. Of course, if there's some news that wants broadcasting before then, I'll send out an email, If I win the lottery and the movie is immediately funded, I'll let you know.
That would be awesome. That's it. But we'll do some prayers for that.
Those will be very welcome.
Thank you, Mike.
Good night. So long, Jim. See you
Thank you.
soon.
Take good care.
Sandy, see you. Delia, later.